Disclaimer: the views expressed on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek are solely the opinions of the host and the guest. The content of the conversation is not reflective of the institutions or establishments mentioned therein. Take all these opinions with a pinch of salt and a dash of lime if needed.
Namaskara, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching or listening, and welcome to this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek. I have a giant ass pimple over here on my right cheek, and my hair's a little all over the place, but we're gonna get going with this latest episode. For those of you listening this, if you want to, you probably won't be able to see how big the pimple is, but I did kind of point towards it. It's at a weird place. But yeah, if you do want to check it out, you can always go and watch this on YouTube as well. Or on Spotify for that matter. Great way to promote. Anyway, in this episode, I'm going to be talking about something a little more serious. That being the news. And like most solo episodes that I've done so far, no preparations has gone into this whatsoever. I'm just going to be speaking right out of my ass. So take all of this, as I usually say in the intros to these episodes, with a pinch of salt and a dash of lime. But without further ado, let's get into it. So, the news. It's quite an interesting entity that exists in society. It was part of society as a means for us to stay informed as an everyday person. The news was our source for things that happened around the places that we lived, or in the countries that we lived, or from around the world. You would get updates from things happening in the United States, to things happening in India, to things happening in China. As we all know, unfortunately, the news is mostly filled with coverage regarding the Russian and Ukraine conflict today. But I'm not going to be speaking about that. I'm just going to be solely speaking about the news and my opinion on the news. For those of you who've followed this from the jump, followed this as in followed the podcast from the jump, I've always mentioned that, or I mentioned in the beginning actually, I should say, mainly in the episode that I recorded with Hazik last year, that I stay away from watching the news. Now that has slightly changed. I do follow the news, but I do have my sources that I follow. But one of the major reasons that I stopped following the news, and one of the major reasons that I started this endeavor, or passion project, if you want to call it that, was what we know as news today. Now, I do understand that there are many different sources, and I am not necessarily speaking about all of the news that we see in the world today, but more so about the mainstream news that we see in front of our eyes, or they take up a lot of space on social media platforms and so on and so forth. This could be in the United States or this could be in India, for that matter. I think there's a lot of similarities in the way that news entities in both countries operate, so it doesn't necessarily make them much different other than the things that they probably cover and the things that they hold near and dear to their coverage, so to speak. So going back to my point of how the news itself led to what I'm doing today and my thoughts on it. A lot of this started back in, I want to say mid 2020, so to speak. Excuse me. When the pandemic initially began, I was quite reliant on the news for constant updates, constant information about the things that were changing, about the mandates that were changing, about the numbers and whether they were improving or if they were going down or I said the same thing there in terms of improving and going down, but I wanted to sort of keep up with the fluctuation of the numbers and in terms of the COVID cases and also be informed. And I don't mind mentioning what I watched. I would usually watch YouTube clips of news anchors from MSNBC and CNN. Um, and at that time, I did know that there were different spectrums, or they were on different ends of the spectrum in comparison to, let's say, Fox News, in terms of their coverage and their political alignments, so to speak. So yeah, I used to watch a lot of MSNBC videos and CNN videos on YouTube, but I noticed myself gradually feeling worse than feeling better about the information being provided to me by the news. Now, as I'm talking about this, I do see that the fact that they were talking about morbid stuff like COVID and deaths and things like that could be a contributor to this, excuse me. But also just the entire coverage in general and what I started to learn about the the major news companies as they are today, just gradually started to turn me away from it for my own sanity. Because I think at the end of the day, we need to protect our sanity at all costs, right? We need to do the best that we can to make sure that we're not losing it. So, for me, it was important to stop watching the news and just stay away from it. Because I'm a Twitter user, I did see updates pop up on Twitter. I would see articles pop up, or tweets pop up with articles linked to them and so on and so forth. So I would get some little bits and pieces of the news through those sources, but I never really followed the news fully after sometime in mid 2020. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I do follow the news, but I do have my sources. One main source, I should say, actually, which I will get into towards the end of the episode. But going back to the major sticking point that drew me away from it, it's just the negativity. It's just the negativity. And I've heard people speak about this on many fronts in many different places about the sort of biases that news channels have. And again, I've probably said this 1,000 times, and I don't mind repeating this for the millionth time, that there are different news sources, and I am mainly speaking about mainstream media that we see blaring on television screens through cable TV and so on and so forth in the US or in India for that matter. Speaking of India, I haven't necessarily paid much attention to the news over there, or the news channels over there, I should say, ever since I've moved to the US. But I do remember watching debates of a certain Arnab Goswami at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the night, where he's just having a screaming match with the other pundits, so to speak. So just thinking about that and what you sort of see on mainstream media over here, maybe not much of the screaming matches, but in just in terms of the way that they portrayed the news, there's a lot of similarities that can be drawn, as I've mentioned earlier. So yeah, it's just the negativity and the sort of the things that they cherry pick to show you. Because at the end of the day, they have a narrative that they need to follow, which unfortunately is mainly informed by the people that put money in their pockets. and they cherry pick the things they want to form a narrative and then feed it to us. Now, the public in general, unfortunately, doesn't have the mental energy to have to constantly go in and check their sources like 100 times, check each and everything that they're watching. Because in most cases, and I'm speaking about this from the things that I've seen, in most cases, people tend to watch the news while they are done from a day's work, or if they're commuting from one place to another, and so on and so forth. So, all of these moments wherein they watch the news, I think personally, it doesn't necessarily provide them with an option to be able to check what they're watching and check to see if what they're listening to and what they're watching is actually accurate or actually informative. Be it with the whole peddling of certain narratives by different news channels, or with the certain backgrounds that you hear about these people once certain scandals come out. Like recently in the US, we've had the scandal associated with the Cuomo family and the, I guess he's the president. Was he the president? I believe he was. A person by the name of Jeff Zucker, excuse me. And his role in CNN and so on and so forth. And even with certain stories associated with Arnab Goswami and him leaving Times Now, which was a major news channel in India, to start something on his own called Republic, if I'm not mistaken. There's a lot of baggage that these people carry in terms of what they want to say and what the people that pay them want to say. It's very odd that the thing that's meant to inform you is making you sad or making you angry or making you frustrated or making you just upset at the whole world or making you feel like there is a sense of doom in this world or that the end is near. And I felt that way. I felt that way watching the news while COVID had started. A part of me felt like all of this might come to an end. Um, 20, 21 years of existence was good, but then maybe it's coming to an end. I'm not saying that I overthought about this thing. I didn't necessarily sit with this thought and marinate with it, or let it marinate in my head rather. But I did have that feeling. And a lot of people in society do today. There is a feeling of impending doom. There is a feeling of the end being very near. And unfortunately today, I don't mean to make light of it, but unfortunately today, even with the conflict happening in Ukraine, it just adds to that fuel of this sense of the end being near. It's really weird. It's really weird how the dynamics of this work, in that something that is meant to inform you is making you angry. But why is that? In my opinion, and my opinion is informed based off of my experience and the things that I've watched. So, as I've mentioned earlier, take this with a pinch of salt. But at the end of the day, these companies are here to make money. The people that work for them are here to make money. And commercial interests, unfortunately, take priority over actually informing people. Because if the news was meant to, again, mainstream news, if the mainstream news is actually meant to inform people, why would we be seeing this constant mudslinging between Fox and CNN in the US, or this sort of peddling of a certain agenda by Navika on Times Now, or an Arnab, or I don't know, somebody else on NDTV? There are a couple names floating in my head, like a Barka Dutt or a Pranay Roy. What are their agendas? Look, I don't know these people personally, so I don't want to be very dismissive of their agendas and who they are as people. But I do think that these questions need to be asked. Why are these people who are, I'm pretty sure, being told by their bosses to sling mud at certain narratives and only feed the public that is watching them a certain narrative? Why is it that these people continue to do their jobs? Or stay in those jobs, I should say. Is it just the money that is keeping them there? Because I know money is very hard to come by in this world, and it's not easy to make money, but it's not impossible to make money either, I guess. And I'm being very tangential with all of these things that I'm saying. But like I said, I'm talking out of my ass, so I'm gonna keep talking about my opinions on the news and the people who work for them. It's really interesting to think about why these people continue to work in such places. Do they have certain dilemmas of their own that maybe make them think about the things that they're saying, the narratives that they're parroting? Do they think about the implications of the narratives that they're peddling in terms of how the public will receive it and how they will further use those narratives and act on them? Do these people try to actually find some nuance in the arguments that the other side makes? And look, I I don't watch these news channels enough to know how much nuance their arguments hold or how much they actually care about giving the news. But these are just questions that I ask based off of what I know, because as the days go on, it's like they find something they want to talk about and they hang on to it. And once they've sucked all the juice out of it, once they just end up with the seed of that juicy mango, they toss that seed out, another mango comes in, or another orange, if you get that joke. Well, but some oranges don't have seeds. Anyway, if I try to break that joke down a little more, that joke won't stay a joke. But anyway, for those of you who didn't get it, I don't mind saying it out. I think I was referring to the previous president and how of the United States and how he was referred to as Orange Man. But anyway, I digress. You see with a lot of these news channels that they have certain things that they hang on to go back to my previous point, before I went into a tangent about fruits. They have narratives that they hang on to. You see one day you see for a certain period of time they speak about a particular person or a particular ideology, and everything at the end of the day ties back to that ideology, even though it wouldn't necessarily make any sense. And then once there is no means to having any conversations associated with that integral figure of theirs, it is switched by somebody else. And as I'm talking about this, I'm trying to think if some of these things that I'm saying are me just vomiting out the things that I've heard, or if I actually believe these. And I will say that I believe probably 90% of everything that I've said so far. But I think we do have human tendencies to where we tend to parrot some things that we hear without necessarily processing them enough. But that's a conversation for another day. But hey, that's the frailties of being a human, right? But in a way, I think it's also a good thing because it helps you dig into your own beliefs and find out what you actually believe in and what actually builds the foundation of your system of beliefs. But anyway, if you're watching this on YouTube or on Spotify and are seeing some things fall down, it's just some dust from the ceiling, I guess. I don't know where it's coming from or what it is, but it's something. Anyway, I'll probably need to look into that here. But yeah, where was I? I was talking about the narratives and the peddling of narratives associated with one certain thing. So yeah, people say that Joe Rogan is the new Donald Trump for the more left-leaning media in terms of the things that he says on his podcast and the guests that he has on and so on and so forth. Now, this is coming from someone who admires Joe Rogan for what he does. But I do understand in some respects. I don't understand, well, not that I don't understand, but I don't necessarily agree with all the arguments some mainstream media channels make about the things that people on his podcasts say. However, it goes back to the thing that I said. They cherry pick certain things that are said on the podcast and turn those into and sensationalize those into a certain type of news. Now, don't get me wrong. He's probably done things that I don't agree with and I don't see eye to eye on. 100%. 100%. However, maybe on another episode I could go into that a little more about Joe Rogan and censorship and so on. But let's stick to the news aspect of this. Because the left-leaning media had a certain narrative to peddle, they picked a person they needed that was ideal for them and just ran with it. And I'm sure the same thing happens on the other side too with Fox News. I don't pay attention to them enough to know about it, but I've just seen this through social media because I follow Joe Rogan's podcast. I follow the Joe Rogan. Excuse me. Whoa. Wow, that took me back for a second. Okay. I apologize for those of you listening to this in earphones if that was loud. But yeah, it's unfortunate that things like this happen with the news. I apologize if you can hear any background noise. I'll try to minimize it as much as I can in post, but yeah, I apologize about that. But yeah, it's just, I don't know what's happening on the other side, so I can't necessarily speak much about it. But at the end of the day, the news is here to inform us. And it is unfortunate to see what has happened to it over time. Has it always been this way? I don't know, because I've not lived long enough. But from one of the previous podcast conversations that I've had, which was with, damn, I can picture the person's face in my head, but the name is escaping me. Oh, damn. Jeez. Yeah, I guess it's just it's just one of those days with the messy hair, big pimple, and thoughts that don't seem to be coming back. But as I say that, yes, the name pops into my mind. It was a conversation that I was having with Rasta, where he had mentioned that things had changed with the news sometime around the 80s or whenever Ronald Reagan was president. So yeah, it was unfortunate to see what is happening, but at the same time, I have spoken to some people who are involved with the news, mainly a friend of mine, Amanda Sue, and one of her professors, Desiree Hill, both of whom have been in the podcast in the previous year. And I'll link those episodes down below if you're curious to watch them. But Amanda always tended to mention that mainstream media has this sort of baggage that they carry about peddling certain narratives that are fueled by the funding that they get to peddle certain narratives and fuel certain propagandas and so on and so forth. There's a lot of local news sources that are doing their due diligence to share what they can. So the people of today can always rely on those. There's also a channel that I follow quite often called Breaking Points, which is hosted by Sagar Enjeti and Crystal Ball, both of them who had worked for The Hill, I believe. I never really followed their content on The Hill, but I was introduced to them through Joe Rogan, and I really like the way that they speak about things. Do I agree with their opinions at all times? Of course not. But that's every human being, you know. There's some things that you will agree with, there's some things that you won't agree with, and that is fine. But I feel like they speak very well about the news, because Crystal being a left-leaning person and Sagar being a more right-leaning person, they both share their perspectives on different news topics and so on, and I think they do a great job in informing people. This is more US centric, but if you are in the US and you're interested in finding a different news source, I would definitely recommend them. And I will link them down below as well, in the description or in the show notes, wherever you're listening or watching this. And they are associated with quite a few other journalists, like a Kyle Kulinski, or a Matt Stoller, and so on, who do really great work. So I haven't necessarily, or from what I've heard, I should say, I haven't necessarily checked out their work individually, but I have heard of them through Crystal and Saga. So yeah, at the end of the day, with the news, I do feel like it comes down to us doing our own due diligence. We need to do our part to make sure that we are informed. Yes, but we also need to do our part to make sure that we are well informed and not necessarily just digesting a narrative that someone sitting up in a tower in New York wants us to hear. So yeah, I don't know if it's New York or in Delhi or wherever it may be around the world. A certain group of people might want you to listen to a certain narrative, but it comes down to us with the news to do our own due diligence and do the research that we can to inform ourselves better and make informed decisions rather than being a part of the herd of sheep. And it's unfortunate that we have a lot of people who unfortunately just consume these narratives and believe them to be fully true without them necessarily seeing the nuance that might be associated with those narratives. But I do believe that if we can keep each other informed in terms of making the right decisions with the news, it can go a long way. As long as people are open to changing up their news sources. So, with that being said, I'm going to call it good for today. On this episode that I've spoken out of my ass on. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. My opinions on the news. And feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, or reach out to me on Instagram or at random relatability through DMs. And if you're willing to have a conversation with me, I'd be more than happy to chat it up with you, or speak to you on a podcast episode. So yeah, thank you so much once again for being a part of this platoon of perspectives. Take care, stay safe, and don't forget to keep your mind open to different perspectives, because you never know, random relatability might just be around the corner.